Today's lesson will be from Chapter 26, Problem 6b. What we're going to be doing in this problem is we're going to be evaluating four proposals named A through D. And what they've shown us about these proposals is that they've given us the amount of the investment for each proposal. And notice that all of these investment amounts are different amounts here. We have also been given the number of years and the useful life of each one of the investments. And each one of these investments has a useful life of 5 years. They've also given you the estimated amount of income that could be produced from each of these proposals. And they've given you the amount of the net cash flow that they are expecting from each one of these proposals. So what we're going to do is we're going to rank the four proposals. They're telling us in this example that the company's capital rationing policy requires a minimum cash payback period of 3 years. In addition, they want a minimum average rate of return of 12% that is required on all the projects. If the preceding standards are met, then what we're going to do is use the net present value method, and the present value indexes are going to be used to rank the remaining proposals. So what we're going to start with is some ways to rank these proposals without using net present value analysis. And then if they meet our test, which management wants the cash payback period to be a minimum of 3 years, and management also wants an average rate of return to be 12%. If they meet these two criteria, then we're going to subject these proposals further to net present value analysis. And we're going to be using the present value of a dollar table, which is our lump sum table here, for present value analysis. In requirement number 1, they want us to compute the cash payback period for each of the four proposals. Now, we haven't done this yet, and so this is going to be new to you. So I've highlighted in bold here the steps that you're going to need to use to prepare the cash payback period. To calculate the cash payback method, you're going to add the yearly cash flows together until the total cash flow accumulates to the cost of the investment. Do not accumulate more than the cash flows than the cost of the investment. So in other words, we're going to be looking at our cash flows, and you can see in each one of these proposals, we've got cash flows that were given to us, and we're going to accumulate these cash flows until they reach the 680,000, and that's going to tell us how much time it's going to take for us to pay back the initial cost of the investment. Now we do not want to accumulate more cash flows than the cost of the investment. Also, you need to take into consideration, if the accumulated cash flow goes over the amount of the investment, we're going to drop back to the previous year accumulated cash flow. Once we've done this, we're going to find the difference between the previous accumulated cash flow and the cost of the investment. Once we've done this, we're going to divide the next year's cash flow that was given by 12 months to get the monthly amount of cash flow. And then finally, we're going to divide the monthly cash flow by the difference between the previous accumulated cash flow and the cost of the investment. So these are the steps that it takes for you to compute the cash payback period. And we're going to do this for each of the 4 proposals. I'm going to start with proposal A. I'm going to start with year 1, the annual cash flow amount. Remember, that was given. This is proposal A. Year 1's annual cash flow was $200,000. If we receive $200,000 in cash flows during year 1, that will be the accumulated cash flow at the end of year 1. In year 2, we're expecting some more cash flows. So go back to see what the cash flows were in year 2. It just so happens they were $200,000 that they were expecting again in year 2. So in year 2, we're going to write down the cash flow that was given, and then we're going to combine it with the previous year's accumulated cash flow at the end of the year. So in year 1, it was $200,000. In year 2, we're expecting to receive $200,000 more. So we have a total accumulated cash flow of $400,000. Notice this accumulated cash flow does not go over the cost of the investment. So we're going to go on to the next year's cash flow. And the next year's cash flow, it just so happened to be $200,000. So the cash flow in year 3 was $200,000. So I put down the cash flow of year 3 as $200,000. I'm going to add that to the accumulated cash flow from year 2, and that's going to bring us to a total of $600,000 as accumulated cash flow at the end of year 3. That $600,000, you'll notice, is getting close to the cost or the investment amount, which was $680,000. So now we're going to look at year 4's cash flow. Notice that if we added $160,000 to the previous accumulated cash flow, which would have been $600,000, that it would go over the $680,000 investment. We don't want to do that. So we know that a cash payback period is at least 3 years and some months. We're going to need to figure out how many months it takes in the 3rd year to completely recover the amount of the investment of $680,000. So here's what we do. Look at your steps. We found the accumulated cash flow at the end of year 3 is $600,000. Now we want to find the difference between the cost of the investment, which was $680,000, and what we've accumulated in cash flow. That difference is $80,000. We're going to look at the next year's cash flow amount, which is $160,000. I'm getting that by looking at what happened to the cash flow for proposal A in year 4. It was $160,000. You see that right there? For year 4, it was $160,000 was the cash flow. I'm going to take $160,000, the cash flow for year 4, and I'm going to divide it by 12 months to get the monthly amount of the cash flow that we would be recovering during that year. The monthly amount is $13,333.33. I went ahead and rounded it right here. So the last step is to take the difference between the initial investment and your accumulated cash flow, which was $80,000. We're going to divide that by the monthly amount of cash flow in year 4, and that will give us 6 months. So what this is telling us is that we can pay back the 680,000 in 3 years and 6 months. So under the cash payback method, we've calculated that proposal A will take us 3 years and 6 months to recover the cost of the initial investment. So that's how you do the cash payback period. You do it the same way for each of the proposals. But note, in each proposal, the initial cost or the investment amount is going to be different in each of these situations that they've given us. So where the initial investment for proposal B is $320,000. Our cash flows for year 1 is $90,000 for proposal B. So I'm going to make me a table just like I did before. I'm going to write down the year, which is year 1, the annual cash flow, which is $90,000. At the end of year 1, I would have accumulated $90,000 in my cash flow of cash flows for that year. $90,000 does not recover the full amount of $320,000. So we're going to pick up the next year's cash flow, which again just happens to be $90,000. In year 2, the annual cash flow was $90,000. I'm going to add that to my accumulated cash flow from year 1 to get me a total cash flow at year 2 of $180,000. Notice $180,000 is not $320,000. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up my third year. The third year amount was $70,000. So I'll write down $70,000 for the third year of my annual cash flow. I'm going to add it to the previous year's cash flow to get the accumulated cash flow of $250,000. $250,000, if you were to subtract that from the $320,000, leaves you with $70,000. It just so happens that the cash flow in year 4 is $70,000. So $70,000 is added to the $250,000 accumulated cash flow from year 3 to get $320,000. So it took us 4 full years to pay back proposal B. For proposal C, the initial amount of the investment was $108,000. We're expecting $55,000 in cash flows from year 1. So year 1, excuse me, let me get on the right one. Year 1, $55,000 will give you an accumulated cash flow of $55,000. In year 2, they had $53,000. So the accumulated cash flow in year 2 was $53,000. When we add that to the annual cash flow was $53,000 in year 2. When we add the year 2's annual cash flow back to the accumulated cash flow for year 1, it brings us to $108,000, which is the initial cost of this investment. So proposal C took us 2 years to pay back that proposal. And then in our fourth proposal, which is proposal D, our initial cost is $400,000. The cash flow was $180,000 in the first year. So we know that didn't recover the $400,000. So we put it in our table. Year 1, $180,000 goes right here. We're going to move on to year 2. cash flow in year 2 was also $180,000. When we combine the cash flow for year 2 with the accumulated cash flow, it brings us to $360,000. Notice that's close to $400,000. So in year 3, if we took the entire cash flow, we'd go over the $400,000. So we got to draw back to the accumulated cash flow in year 2, which was $360,000. We're going to compare it to the initial cost. That means that we have $40,000 that we have left to recover to determine our cash payback period. In the next year, the cash flow was estimated to be $160,000. We divide it by 12 to get the monthly amount that we will be recovering. Once we know the monthly amount that we're recovering, we're going to divide that into the $40,000 that we have left to recover, and that will give us 3 months. So this investment is going to take us 2 years and 3 months to recover the cost of this investment. So that's the cash payback method. In the second part of this problem, they want you to further evaluate each one of these proposals using the average rate of return method. And you'll remember we went over the average rate of return in a previous video. I just wrote down the formula again, but you need to learn these formulas. So the formula for the average rate of return is to take the estimated average annual net income. Notice this is not cash flow this time, this is net income. Divide it by the average investment. To get the average investment, we'll take the initial cost plus any residual value, if we have any, and divide it by 2. So first of all, calculate the estimated annual net income. And I've set this up as a table for each one of the proposals. I'm going to first determine the estimated average annual net income. I do that by looking at the total net income for the investment. In investment A, they have added up all of the income to get $240,000. I'm going to divide $240,000 by the 5-year life, and that will give me the average amount of the estimated annual net income. So the average amount of the estimated annual net income is $48,000. Again, I took the total net income for this proposal and I divided it by the useful life of 5 years, and that gave me $48,000. You're going to find the average investment by taking the initial cost and adding the residual value to that. That's the residual value, is the amount that's left over after you fully depreciated it. And you're going to divide it by 2 to get an average. In this problem, they told you that there was no residual value. Let me see where they told you that. Right here in part 2, assuming there is no residual value. So we don't have to worry about residual value. All we're going to do is take the initial cost of the investment and divide it by 2. The initial cost of proposal A is $680,000. So we're going to simply divide this by 2, and that will give us the average investment. Notice I've written down a place for the average investment, so you can calculate the average rate of return by taking the $48,000 and dividing it by $340,000. This will give you 14.1% rounded. So proposal A has an average rate of return of 14.1%. You do the same thing for each of these proposals. Use these formulas, divide the average investment into the annual net income to get your percentages. Once you've done that, you're going to use the following format to summarize the results of your computations in part 1 and part 2 by placing calculated amounts in the first 2 columns in Cengage is what they're asking you to do. Now, what you have to remember is what they gave you in the instructions. The company's capital rationing policy requires a minimum cash payback of 3 years. So no more than 3 years can be the minimum amount of time in the cash payback period. The minimum average rate of return, which we calculated in part 2, has to be 12%. So what we're trying to do is trying to eliminate some of the proposals based on the maximum cash payback period. So let's look at that first. Remember, the maximum cash payback period can only be 3 years. So in proposal A, the cash payback period was 3 years and 6 months. We would reject this proposal. We're not going to take it into consideration anymore. The cash payback period was more than 3 years. The cash payback period for proposal B was 4 years. It too was more than the minimum amount of 3 years. So we're going to reject proposal B. So that took proposal A and proposal B off of our evaluations. Now we're going to look at proposal C. Notice the cash payback period was 2 years, so it passed that first test. Notice that the cash payback period for proposal D is less than 3 years. So both proposal C and proposal D passed the cash payback period. Then we're going to look at proposal C and D to see if they met the minimum average rate of return, which was calculated in part 2. So proposal D certainly met that 12%. It was 52.6% for proposal C, and proposal D also met the minimum average rate of return. So we're going to accept proposal C and proposal D for further analysis. So we're going to subject proposal C and D for further analysis so we can choose between these 2 proposals. So in part 4, it says for the proposals accepted for further analysis, compute the net present value. And they want you to use a rate of 15%, and they want you to use the present value of the lump sum table, which was given above. They also want you to round to the nearest dollar. So I'm taking proposal C, and I'm going to find the total present value of proposal C first. So what I have to do when I'm calculating present value is we always use the cash flow. So I'm going to look at proposal C, and I'm going to look at the cash flow for year 1. Proposal C, the cash flow for year 1 was $55,000. That's given. That $55,000 is going to be multiplied by the table value factor amount at 15%, because that's what they were expecting as a return on their investment. So I'm going to flip back down here and show you where they said that they were using a rate of 15%. So on this table, we're going to be only using the table value amounts in the 15% column. So proposal C had 55,000 for year one as a cash flow. I'm going to multiply 55,000 times 0.87 to get the present value in the first year of proposal C. So year one, the present value was 47,850. For year two, I'm going to pick up 53,000, which was the cash flow in year two. I'm going to multiply that by 0.756. And that will give me the cash flow, or the present value of the cash flow for year two. And again, you can see here where I put it in this formula here. So if you get lost, that's what we're doing. Take your cash flows for year three, and we're going to multiply it by the table value amount for year three. Year three, the cash flow was 50,000 times 0.658. The present value is 32,900. For year four, we're going to take the cash flow for year four, which was 47,000, and we're going to multiply it by the table value amount of 0.572, which was year four. And that will give you the present value in year four. That gives you 26,884. And we do it for the last year, for year five. We're going to take the cash flow, which was 45,000, and multiply it by 0.497 to get the present value in year five. We're going to combine all of these together to get the total present value. Then we're going to compare this total present value to the initial cost of the investment. The initial cost of proposal C is 108,000. Then we're going to simply subtract the cost from the total present value, and that gives us a positive amount of net present value of $60,067. For proposal D, we do exactly the same thing. We take our cash flow that we are expecting for proposal D in each year and multiply it by the table value amount at 15% interest. Once we have done that for each year, we add it up to get a total present value of 494,920. We're going to compare it to the initial cost of the investment for proposal D, which was given. This is the cost of the investment, 400,000. And then we're going to compare it to the present value amount. And again, we got a positive amount of net present value at 94,920. In part 5, they want you to compute the present value index. So you need to know the formula to compute the present value index, which I've given you here. You're going to take the present value of the annual cash flows, which you already calculated in the previous example, For proposal C, it was $170,067. The present value of the annual cash flows is going to be divided by the amount to be invested. The amount to be invested was $108,000. When we divide that, that gives us a present value index of 1.57. The higher this amount is, the better. For proposal D, we do exactly the same thing. We take our present value, which was $494,920 that we calculated above, and we divide it by the cost of the investment. And that will give you the amount of the present value index, which is 1.24. Then in part 6, they want you to rank the proposals from most attractive to least attractive based on the present values of the net cash flows computed in part 4. So we're going back to part 4 here. Proposal D had the highest amount, so we would rank it first. So if you're just looking at computing the net present value, then proposal D is what we would want to accept. In the next part, part 7, they want you to rank the proposals from most attractive to least attractive based on the present value indexes. That's what we calculated in part 5. Notice in part 5, proposal C had the highest one. So we would rank it first over proposal D. So which one should we choose? The present value indexes indicate that although proposal D has the larger net present value, it's not as attractive as proposal C in terms of present value per dollar investment. In other words, proposal D requires a larger investment. Thus, management should use the resources for proposal C before they would invest in proposal D. And that is if they're just using quantitative methods for evaluation purposes. There could be some non-qualitative methods that you might also want to consider, such as employee morale, about the investment, things that don't really have numeric value associated with them. So this chapter was teaching you how to rank different proposals and how to choose proposals for potential investing in assets of the company. This is the last video that I'm going to prepare for you in this chapter. And so I guess we'll see you again at another time. So we'll stop sharing this with you and we'll see you again. Bye-bye.